climate justice into our IV drip. Wait, okay. You know what blew my mind? Dr. Zoanne. She's a doctor and a producer, running shows, saving lives. I thought I was doing something when I switched from dairy to oat milk. This woman is really out here. She's a superhero. Oh my goodness, I can't even run a Google Calendar without electrolytes. And Zoanne, Dr. Zoanne, is out here running shows. Speaking of electrolytes, have y'all tried out that bevy machine? Don't sleep, because if you sleep, now you done slept on it and you'll be sad later. You'll be groggy. Oh, guys, I'm up here talking to y'all like y'all know who I am. Hi, I'm Rashida Crockett. I am your host today for day one of the Hollywood Climate Summit. This is the only stage in Hollywood where Earth is the star. I am up here to present the person who will be presenting our next panel, Displaced Within. So I would love to bring to the stage right now Rupa Balasubramania, Senior Vice President at Pop Culture Collaborative, to introduce our next panel.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Rupa Balasubramanian, and I'm thrilled to be here at the Hollywood Climate Summit, representing the Pop Culture Collaborative. We are a philanthropic fund investing in storytellers, creatives, artists who are building a new center of cultural power in Hollywood. I'm also a decades-long Angelino, and I'll never, ever forget standing in my apartment looking out the window on the evening of January 7th, probably much like many of you, witnessing my city engulfed in flames. And over the next several weeks, watching whole neighborhoods burned to the ground. During that time, two things became super clear to me. First, as much as I really complain about this city, it is sprawling, abundant, singular in its nature, and I really, really love it. And second, I realized we can't keep living in these unsustainable ways. These fires and its aftermath have changed us all. And that's why it's profound to be having this conversation in this town, in this time. A time when there is both possibility and opportunity to be audacious in our vision for a resilient Los Angeles, one that can serve us all and the beautiful land that we all share. That's why we at the Pop Culture Collaborative look to Patrice and Gabrielle, who will be grounding us today in a land acknowledgement, to fill this space. I'm making this comment before Gabrielle joins us on stage, but I know that her blessing, her powerful blessing, will help guide us in our conversation today. And without much more fanfare or ado, I am delighted to also welcome our moderator, best-selling author, abolitionist, and visionary leader, the one and only Patrice Cullors.
Well, thank you, everyone. For those of you that were already here before when I did my first land acknowledgement, I appreciate it. So if you are here again, I thank you. So, Iha Tovetamet Netwanene Gabrielle Crow. So, hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Crow. I am the co-chair as well as the Secretary of Environmental Sciences for the Gabrielino Shoshone Nation. I'm honored to be here to not only give a land acknowledgement, but also just honored to be here in space with all of you that are just creative minds that are helping to make a better difference in our environment, not only here in Los Angeles, but in the world. So thank you. So we acknowledge that the Gabrielino Tongva, the Gabrielino Shoshone, and the Quiche peoples are the traditional land stewards and knowledge bearers of the Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the Southern Channel Islands. Tovangar is a word that translates to the world in our ancestral language, because to us, our ancestral territory is our world. I'm here today to honor our Hunukvatam, our ancestors, our Ahiharom, our elders, our Eohinkam, our relatives, relations past, present, and emerging. I myself wouldn't be here today without the strength and resilience of my ancestors. So a land acknowledgement is just that. It's the beginning point of a relationship with the first people of the lands that you're on. I encourage you all to realize and look to the information and the guidance that you've all received from your ancestors. But that being said, Los Angeles is now home to millions of people. And now, because of that, we're all woven into a tapestry of modern history. So the choices that we make in regard to our environment and building these meaningful relationships will nurture and ensure a brighter future for Los Angeles for the next 7 generations. So, Awishkonaha, thank you.
Thank you. Can I also invite the rest of the panelists on? Come on up. It's really great to be here. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, and we are going to get into it. My name is Patrice Cullors. It has been 152 days since the Los Angeles wildfires broke out. More than 15,000 structures destroyed, over 29 lives lost. For some, the fires have been extinguished, but for many of us, our lives remain in crisis. I was displaced for 6 weeks with my large family, and during those early days, we stalked the Watch Duty app like proper fanatics. It was a lifeline to our homes and our community. I slept very little, wondering what this moment would make of my city, a place I've called home for generations. In the wake of these fires, I launched a coalition alongside Lauren Bond of Metabolic Studio, Gabrielle Crow of the Gabrielina Shoshone Nation, and Marcos Aguilar of Anahuac. Together, we formed the Climate Resilient LA Coalition. We centered the work around traditional ecological knowledge, which our indigenous relatives have stewarded for millennia, and we uplifted the 30 by 30 strategy, a powerful call to conserve 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. And today, we gather at the Hollywood Climate Summit to hear from experts, writers, journalists, and community members, voices of those who have called this land home for a few years to thousands of years. Each of these panelists have an urgent call for us to treat climate resilience not as an abstract goal, but as a lived commitment to community, justice, and the planet that we share. As we hold these conversations, I ask that we center the voices of those most impacted, that we honor the land we stand on, and that we remain unwavering in our commitment to build a future where our communities can thrive, heal, and lead. With that, I'm really excited to get into this panel. Thank you all so much. So I'm just going to have each of you introduce yourselves by sharing your name, affiliation, and a brief response to this prompt. What is your personal relationship to climate disaster, extreme weather, and or climate displacement? I'm going to start with you, Saket.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Saket Soni. I run an organization called Resilience Force. It's wonderful to be here. And to those of you in the audience and on stage who went through the terror of the fires and the 100 crises a day after that, the compounding problems, I just want to say I get it. My heart goes out to you all. I have been living in climate disaster zones for 20 years, since Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath of Katrina in the Gulf Coast. I have been organizing among the people who rebuild after disasters and those for whom they rebuild. So I'm a citizen of disaster zones, in a sense.
Thank you. Elisa?
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. It was a wonderful introduction and really so grateful to be sharing the stage with all of you. My name is Alyssa Walker. I'm a journalist. I'm a co-host of LA Podcast, which is a weekly news podcast about LA. And I also started a newsletter recently last year called Torched, which was not about this, but is now. But what I'm doing in my newsletter is tracking LA's mega event era. So we have the World Cup coming next year, the Olympics and Paralympics. We have some Super Bowls and All-Star games thrown in there, and how the city is preparing or not preparing for these. They are like disasters in many ways, descending upon our region, and they do historically contribute to quite a bit of displacement as well. But as a longtime journalist, climate journalist, I have written about probably every disaster that of the last 20 years as well, and had that same feeling looking out my window, being like, and it's happening here now, and now I get to see how my own city reacts to it, which has not been great. But there's been some good things that have happened. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Rafael?
Hi, my name is Rafael Agustin. I am a TV writer, the vice chair of the Center for Investigative Reporting, which publishes Mother Jones and Reveal. And I'm a member of the National Film Preservation Board at the Library of Congress. But more importantly for this conversation, I'm still currently evacuated from my home in Altadena. If you don't know Altadena, it's like a cute, beautiful, little eclectic community nestled in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, where 1 in 5 residents are Black and 1 in 4 residents are Latino. I mention that because outside of Spanish language media, I feel that like the Latino narrative of the Eaton fire has been mostly excluded. And I just want to point out that my heart goes out to the undocumented community of Altadena who were hit twice by this fire. One, when they lost their home, and 2, when they lost their jobs at the homes that they worked at. So there's a lot of great organizations doing great work with the migrant community of Altadena, like the Pasadena Community Job Center, but even them, they're being attacked by this administration for harboring quote unquote illegals. So it's been very rough out there, but the thing that has kept me, has filled my heart has been how community has come together in Altadena, how the greater Los Angeles community has come out to volunteer for our community and has been donating to GoFundMe campaigns with families they've never met before. And that has really reinforced my belief in the human spirit. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And Gabrielle, you introduced yourself already, but I think this question around your personal relationship to climate disaster, extreme weather, and/or climate displacement feels particularly urgent when it comes to your community.
Yeah, so I will go a little bit more into the history in a little bit, so I'll spare you talking more about that right now. But, for myself, I know in my career, I've been working as a cultural and environmental educator for 20 years or so. A lot of my education has been ocean education, and just the things that we've been able to see in our changes in our ocean itself based on pollution and temperature changing, sea level rise has really not only affected obviously the marine ecosystems, but also the tribal communities that thrive in getting sustenance from those ocean ecosystems. So that's kind of a loaded question as far as climate change, climate disaster, and affecting indigenous communities, especially in Los Angeles. Historically, our tribes have been left out of the conversation when it comes to any of this policy on the coastline or any policy that's in our actual tribal territory. And it's not until more so recently that we've actually been able to be recognized for our knowledge bearing and recognized by the state of California and the harms that have happened to our peoples. But yet at the same time, we too are fighting battles against the current administration. And so we feel protected in some ways to be in the state of California, but there's also a lot of work that needs to happen. And so just being on the front lines and also seeing what's happening to our traditional territories, but also realizing because of the effects of colonization and urban development and everything that's happened, there's been a lot of things that have happened that have been out of our hands for a very long time. And so now it's being able to come into these conversations and really talk about what can we do in the rebuild process, because so many things have happened that have negatively affected our traditional territories in the past. And so how do we move on together as the greater Los Angeles community after this has happened? So loaded question, because there's been a lot of things that have happened to our indigenous community also that our tribes are not federally recognized. And so we actually don't even have that protection. So all of us are basically even struggling to even survive living in our own ancestral territory. So there's it's a lot of things with that.
Thank you so much. Saket, I met you in 2006
I remember.
in New Orleans.
You're unforgettable.
As are you. I
Oh,
remember just being mind blown as you were kind of sharing with many of us who were not from New Orleans coming in to support, doing mutual aid, political education. So I want to really start with you around this question. You've worked at the intersection of climate change and migration for much of your career, first in Louisiana post Katrina and now across the country. What is your origin story in this work, and what is the current reality of internal climate displacement and migration in the US?
sure. Well, so, here in the LA fires, the number that one keeps hearing is a loss of about 12,000 homes, 12 to 15,000 homes. Likely there are an equal number of homes to be repaired, but just imagine, if you will, a million homes being lost. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there were a million homes to be rebuilt in Louisiana and another million in Mississippi. And we weren't as familiar at the time with the concept of large-scale disaster. That was really the first one that broke through on the national consciousness. And I arrived in New Orleans as a relief volunteer a few months later with all of those residents largely still displaced. There was a rebuilding effort of post-war proportions to be carried out, and much of that rebuilding was being done by migrant workers, workers who had arrived from Houston, from Atlanta, from further away, from as far away as California and the mountain states. Workers then even came from the Dominican Republic, Brazil, India, and the Philippines. From in and out of the United States, both US-born workers and immigrant workers arrived, and we saw the formation of this extraordinary itinerant workforce that was going deep into the still dark Gulf Coast to rebuild these homes. And they were mostly living in migrant worker camps, parks, and buildings that had been turned into labor camps. And my days would start at 5 in the morning. And if you can imagine it, the gathering spot for all of these workers was under a very tall, 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee. And so I'd begin my days at 5 in the morning under a statue of Robert E. Lee, where contractors would be pulling up in buses, and I'd board the buses with the workers, and we'd go out into the still dark corners of the Gulf Coast where I watched a recovery happen. As residents came back home, and that wasn't inevitable, residents had to fight to get back on their land and in their home. We started building a movement that connected the workers and the residents. These two groups that might have been in collision against each other. But we worked hard to build partnerships between these migrant workers and the residents who arrived. And in the decade that followed after Katrina, Katrina was called a once-in-a-100-year storm. And in the decade that followed, year after year, there were climate-driven disasters. First across the Gulf Coast, and then across the country. And the workers who rebuilt after Katrina followed storm after storm, and I followed the workers to newer disaster zones. Until today, we have now the emergence of an entire workforce that we call the resilience workforce to build homes and communities for residents who are displaced, fueled by billions of dollars of public and private funding, just like here in LA. And so that's been our journey over the last 2 decades now. And along the way, spending about 6 months a year in the last 20 years in disaster zones, my team and I have become in a sense, very, very close partners with displaced residents and very, very close readers of the extraordinary cultural openings that happen when disasters happen. Because while they are tragic and there's nothing good about them, there are extraordinary things that can happen after disasters that couldn't have happened without them.
Thank you so much. I think a lot about, yes, I think a lot about what you're sharing around New Orleans and what's happening in Altadena. For many people who are not from LA, and even if you're from LA, people didn't know what Altadena was. People didn't know about this little town in Altadena, this like gem of a place that really was a cultural hub. And I've thought a lot about what happens when your cultural hub ends up on fire and you lose everything, and what happens to that community. And I want to ask you, Rafael, your experience can feel so overwhelming and consuming. And we got to meet when I brought a bunch of Altadenans together because I was like, you all have to organize.
Yes, you did.
You have to come together. And
Are you unincorporated?
yes, I'm like, come on. It can be hard to imagine expansively when you are tending to such critical and urgent issues for yourself, your loved ones, your home. How does your writing practice interact with your experience of the fires? What comes up for you when you listen to people like Gabrielle talk about such an audacious vision for the next era of rebuilding in LA?
Oh my God, there's so much to unpack. And one question.
Do
Like,
it.
For starters, I was like, wow, Altadena must be a community filled of middle children who are used to being ignored. You know, 4 days after the fires broke out, I had the opportunity to meet with the administrator of the Office of Emergency and Resiliency from the SBA. He flew out from DC and I had the privilege to meet with him to give me some advice of what was going on. And one of the first things he said is that you guys absolutely have to organize, or what's gonna happen to you is what happened in Hawaii, and Altadena is gonna turn into a place just filled of condos. And I was like, oh, I wonder what he means by that. And this is what he means. Today, well, actually 1 year ago from today, corporate ownership of land in Altadena was only 5% of the home purchases. Today, it is over 50% after the fire. So when we're talking about like Altadena is not for sale, this is what we're talking about. This is what we're trying to fight off. As far as my writing, well, ironically enough, I was in the middle of writing a novel when I got displaced. And I look at the manuscript now and I was like, well, now I know what I have to write about. So it's completely changing my novel. And I have the great fortune that I can work with a publication like Mother Jones that allowed me to write my op-ed pieces about what I was seeing on the ground floor those first couple of weeks. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much. Do you want to talk a bit about the pieces that you wrote and like why they felt important to you to get out?
Oh my God, yeah. I actually shared my account of my evacuation because on January 6th, I was celebrating my grandmother's 100th birthday in Altadena. And I should mention that I live with my grandmother and my mom, so we're like a bad episode of the Golden Girls every day at my house. But on January 6th is her birthday, and I was fortunate enough to invite all of my family from as far as North Carolina to Las Vegas to be here for her. And on January 7th, the fires broke out. And the only saving grace for me was my grandma, because she likes to turn up, she already had her flight set to leave to Ecuador, the country of her birth, to go like party
100?
at 100, y'all. I'm like, you can't be flying anymore. She don't care.
That's amazing.
But this is the most amazing thing. I dropped off my abuelita and my mom at LAX at 6 p.m. and the fires ignited at 6:15. It is so crazy. I was evacuated from my home accidentally because I got a call from my neighbor saying, do not come back. So I went to my girlfriend's house by Long Beach, and I thought it was going to be just, overnight, maybe 2 days. At 7 a.m., when there was zero containment, I freaked out because I didn't grab anything from my house, and I did the stupidest thing in the world, and I drove into the fire at 7 in the morning. Please don't ever do that. It's the stupidest thing I've ever done.
I did the same thing.
Did you really?
Yeah.
So you
I know it's because we could talk. We have a whole process around this, right? Like, if you don't know the dangers, but also you're like, I need things.
and and I bought this home for my mom, and I'm a like a child, like an immigrant child, like Catholic guilt, like all these things, and what I most wanted was the documentation that I owned that home, and that's all I kept thinking about. Like, I need to go get that thing, and I drove into the fire, and the Pasadena area was pitch black because of the smoke was covering the sun. My exit, the fire department, the sheriffs were telling people to turn around, but luckily I knew my ways around my streets, so I just ignored them. I got into my home, put on my face mask, turned on my flashlight on my phone because there was no power in the area, and found my documentation and left. And I wanted to share that story mostly because I think we've all read the report by the LA Times that on Lake Avenue, to the west of it, is historically marginalized communities. That's where I live. And we didn't get the evacuation notice until many, many hours after the east side, which is predominantly affluent and white. And if I would have gotten that evacuation notice, I would have been able to prepare myself, and my family would have been able to prepare ourselves. So, there's a lot of things that gotta change, but that's one I really want to focus on.
Thank you for sharing. Really appreciate it. Gabrielle, I'm going to come back to you. As co-founder of Climate Resilient LA, you're helping to steward a very different process of recovery in Los Angeles, one that centers traditional ecological knowledge while also supporting people who have been displaced to stay connected to their communities and histories, even as we imagine a radically different future for our city and county. Can you give us some historical context to the indigenous lands in this area and why this radical reimagination of the future actually matters?
Just all these loaded questions today. No, so for those of us, I know that Los Angeles is obviously now home to many millions of people. Some people have lived here for generations. Some people are newer transplants, whether it's because it's the land of opportunity or other things have brought them to this area. So welcome, you're here now. But for those that like myself, are a product of the California education system, I had to build a mission when I was in fourth grade, which is gross to think about that we had to build for a fourth grade project the same mission that my ancestors also built. And so, obviously there's a lot of change that needs to happen with that, in the fact that, when my own son, who's here today, was in fourth grade during the pandemic, I had asked his teacher point blank, like, what are you planning on doing, talking about the California mission system? And she was just like, whoa, like, she did not want to answer me. And she's like, well, I think we're kind of going to skip it. We're just going to have like a general California history. And I was like, hold on. How can you talk about the history of California without talking about that part of colonization? And so for me, I'm like, no, okay, well, I'm going to come in and do a presentation. But I myself cannot come in and do a presentation to every single classroom to talk about this. So, to give kind of historical context of thousands of years in a quick few minutes, because we only have a certain amount of time in this panel, you talk about the Spanish coming to this area and obviously, establishing, really seeing, hey, this is a really great place. Let's put it in our pocket for another couple of hundred years, and maybe we'll come back to it. They come back to it, and what better way to establish your dominance to the area than to build 21 missions up and down the coast of California, and basically tell everybody that lived in that area, whatever your way of life is, every single thing that you do is completely wrong. The way you dress, you don't have enough clothing on, let's change that. The foods that you're eating, no, we're not gonna do that, but also you're gonna grow these foods for us. We're also gonna have you build this and you can't leave, And so what happens in that time period, 250 years, 200 years, all this tradition, culture, language, connection to the land, living in this reciprocal relationship is lost. And in that time, it wasn't until, so our mission was actually established in 1771. It wasn't until 1978 where we were actually able to practice our culture and traditions again. So how much is lost in 200 plus years? So for myself, I've actually been working on trying to do research on our ancestral language, but we have no more fluent speakers. So we've actually had to go to the Library of Congress and listen to the actual wax cylinders that J.P. Harrington helped record. but also thinking about the history with that, how did they get them to record these things? They provided them with alcohol as payment. So, or I don't think that if I was someone that was singing a traditional song, I'd be like, hey, here's this sacred song, you want to record it? So, there's so many bits and pieces that are missing in that because of that disconnection for 200 years. But it's also in the lands itself. Like our tribe, the Gabrielina Shoshone, have been blessed in the last 2.5 years that we actually got 12 acres of land back, which was one of the biggest pieces of land back in the area. And since then, we've actually used this space and we've established the Chief Yana Regenerative Learning Village, named after my grandmother, Vera Rocha. And in this space, we've actually been able to see what happens when we put our hands back in the soil. What happens when we reintroduce ourselves back to the land? What happens when we're calling these plants by their traditional names? And we also, before we even built anything on the land, wanted to actually bring back our first traditional house there, which is called a key. You guys have maybe seen them before. We used to have one on display at the Natural History Museum that my family built many, many years ago. But the crazy thing is we had a very difficult time to even be able to find the materials to be able to actually build that. Because Bayona Wetlands is the last coastal wetlands that's left in Los Angeles. And I actually had somebody ask me a question a couple months ago that they were like doing research and they're like, hey, I was just wondering, like, did your tribe, like I've been trying to look up and see whether or not the Gabrielino Tongva had like water storage systems or like if they had like large containers of things. And I was like, is this a serious question? And he kind of looked at me, and it's some of that worked like in the environment too. And I wasn't trying to do it to like be rude. It's just water was plentiful here, especially in this area with the confluence of all the water coming down from the mountains and all of the rivers that we had here. The way that they built it and channelized everything afterwards is to prevent the amount of water from flooding these areas, but also our people knew not to build on the floodplains. So it's just, all these concepts, we took away the water, and what are we left with? We've also taken away the native plants and vegetation, and it's always so funny and so Hollywood to go and see all these palm trees, but it's also like we put in all these plants that don't belong here in the place, and we expect that these things that are happening with our temperatures rising and, the droughts that we have, the winds that we have, like, and, we heard it the same thing too, that it's historic, the winds, or every time that we hear this, it's a historic something that's happening. But what's really happening is these are natural occurrences that continue to happen, but because of what we've done to the environment in the last 250 years and through these different waves of not only actual genocide, but also cultural genocide, and not allowing our people our traditional practices of actually natural fire tending to the area and looking at fire as a relative rather as something dangerous and something that we should keep away. A lot of these things that could be preventable at the scale that they happen haven't been able to do that. So we're looking at building things that are centered around community, things that are going to empower the community and have places for people to go when we are, because we're all feeling climate anxiety, right? I have 3 children myself that feel like, what kind of world are we leaving our kids with, right? And they shouldn't be responsible for fixing things that previous generations have done to this planet, especially to Los Angeles. But now that we're all here, we have to be looking towards collective solutions and not only, traditional knowledge, but also balancing that out with modern science and also, combining that with people that can get the stories across like all of you can, to be able to make sure that the same things don't continue to happen, even though we know that our planet is crying for help. But what are we as people that are living here in modern time going to do to help with that? So that is, now that we don't have as much water, we do have to think about having communities be able to get rain barrels and how they have to learn how to use those and in times when we need more water, or have people learn how to be master composters or have community gardens so they know that even if we're feeling the inflation, we feel all these things happening, people losing jobs, everything, where's the next meal going to come? Helping out our communities that are houseless, helping out everybody that's going through all these different crises, helping them with their mental health, because I feel like that's a big part of this conversation that people aren't talking about, that we not only feel climate anxiety, but like it's there's so many other underlying issues that people are having to deal with just to be able to survive on a daily basis in an ecosystem, in an environment that's also set up for us to fail. Like, we shouldn't have to worry about our next meal, but we're also thinking about, how am I going to pay my medical insurance this month, or whether or not I'm going to have medical insurance next month. And so it's all of these combined factors, and on top of the cost of living, or unfortunately for the people that have lost their homes, that whether or not they're going to even be able to rebuild, and if it's not going to be taken somewhere else. So it's just being able to have that sense of community and have that strength in the community and giving it back to us in times when other things are very unknown in the future. So giving us that strength and that power back.
Thank you so much. Lisa, one of the constant realities of social change in Los Angeles and any city or community is the tension between a bold vision and the complex dynamics of government that can sometimes impede progress. What were the biggest roadblocks impeding Los Angeles government and systems in their early response to the wildfires?
Yeah, whoa, okay. Let me try. I think I've been thinking about everything that you were just saying. It's, as someone who writes about this and talks to a lot of scientists, right? They're in agreement with the indigenous knowledge. The breakdown is the policymakers. So, and we know what the right answers are, the people who live in these places, right? So you did see this, and I was sharing Climate Resilient LA's call to action in those first days after the fire. You should all read it, like make sure, I mean, we don't want to go back and relive that. You have other things that you've produced since then. But it was what no one else was saying, which was, you know, land back and look to the people who have lived here, who have, you know, weathered these types of storms. And yes, they are worse now, but that's something else we need to work on. But just in those days after the fires, you saw this information and misinformation, or lack of information, and the alerts were only one small part of it. We had a lot of air quality misinformation, and that was what people were coming to me with. And people did not know, not only because there's been a huge breakdown in that messaging during the pandemic, and with the new administration coming in, it got very terrifying because they actually are like dismantling the health response at the federal level. But really, people did not know where to turn for accurate information and for what they should be doing. But then on the other hand, we had some really awesome tools like Watch Duty, which we all watched, you know, over a free publicly accessible app that was giving us information that was better than the one that our city and county were supposed to be providing. And we could fact check in real time, actually that evacuation alert was wrong, or we could send a message to a friend and tell them don't come back to their house. But you have to kind of look at like, where was the actual information, and it was coming from either, you know, scientists or, you know, the people who were wise about what, you know, what we should be doing in this situation. So I would really hope that we have learned something from that. And I have heard like Watch Duty is going to be working with the city and county to try to have that type of you know, a richer informational experience. You do worry when it's something like an app if everyone has access to the same tools, and that's something that we have to really think about. But as far as the rebuilding process, I have yet to hear, there's really good examples in Altadena of people, you know, trying very hard to look at this, you know, community ownership of land and looking at things like land trusts and kind of getting past the economic realities of rebuilding in a creative way, but you don't hear it from the policymakers. You hear them say, we're getting right back in as fast as we can. We cleared these lots faster than we've cleared them anywhere else in any disaster. Well, that's not great. Like, shouldn't we, I mean, I know people want to get back to their homes, but like, don't we want to do this right? Like, don't we want to make sure that we're not putting people in harm's way again and again and again? So the people are usually right and the scientists are right, but where's the gap? How do we fill that gap to make sure that we're doing this the right way?
Thank you for that. I think that was something that...
Can I add something
yes,
to this?
please.
Because it's so important to the conversation. Coming back home because of the air was my number one concern, especially with my 100-year-old grandmother. I asked for the first couple of months, and no one could give me answers. I asked every single government agency who's responsible for our air. No one could give me a right answer until someone from the county finally said, the state of California is responsible for the air you breathe. I was like, great, I'm gonna call my state senator. I said, you are responsible for the air I breathe. What are we gonna do about it?
But your coalition really did that. I mean, there were press conferences that would not have happened if it hadn't been for you guys pushing for testing and now of soils, and now there's all these other. I mean, you really did that. So it made my job easier because I could point to them and be like, they're doing that now. So.
Yeah, I think for me, I definitely was so confused why our elected officials weren't talking about climate change, weren't talking about original stewards of the land. Just, it was a very odd way to relate to this really major disaster that happened. So I'm glad I'm not the only one that was so confused.
Well, and I was just going to add to just watching the news just this morning, it was just something interesting to think about. Okay, so we're thinking about everything that's happening as far as like in Los Angeles being like, on the global stage over the next couple of years for the different events that we're having. But there was a big thing that they were talking about how there's not as many people coming to California, and especially places like Santa Monica and other things. And I was just like, really in reality, it's like we need to be more aware of what's going on at that beach specifically and in the water specifically before we're telling millions of people to come and visit it. We need to make sure that the area is safe for the people that live here now before we even invite more people into this space. And so I was just like getting mad at the TV because I'm just like, this is not what we're supposed to be focusing on. And so for us with Climate Resilient LA, that's the whole thing that we were thinking about, that it's like, obviously, for people that have lost their homes, it's devastating. For those that lost it in Pacific Palisades, they got, a lot more of news coverage, and there was a lot of things going on there. But they also have a lot more of them have the ability to rebuild, and they've done it before. But also, why do you keep rebuilding the same way if you know it's going to happen again? And so we're not looking at that. And, and I've had some conversations with people too that, they've been talking about, oh, well, there's already mustard growing on our hillside where it burned. So can we just go pick that out ourselves? And for us, as the traditional stewards of this land, it's difficult because since we're not federally recognized, and some of them are in national park areas, like we also have to work with those government agencies to be able to go and do that stewarding there. So it's like, it is a lot of like rogue pulling that stuff out because it's not supposed to be there. But, it's just the thing that you're thinking about, that in real time, nature is already taking over and doing what it did before. And we're, thinking so heavily and like really thinking about these accomplishments as far as rebuilding as fast as possible. And we're like, this is the whole thing that we didn't want to happen. We want to make sure that everybody is actually safe before we even do this. And it is, and that's the thing to think about when we're thinking about millions of people coming over the next few years just to visit us for all these different events that we're having. Like, we need to make sure that the people that live here are safe before we're bringing more people in.
That's right. Thank you so much. So we're at the last few minutes of this panel. It's been really eye-opening and incredible, and you all are such heroes. I want to do a little storytelling. I want to ask you to do some storytelling. And please, they're going to pitch some ideas. Do not steal them. So you're going to keep it in the room. But I want you to just play along with me for a moment. What if we got the story right? Imagine that you could greenlight a film or TV show exploring the story of climate resilience. Of all the people you have encountered as you've navigated the impact of climate displacement, recovery, and rebuilding in the U.S., who is a character or characters you'd most want to be the protagonist of your story? I pick your grandmother. And what is the story you would tell? Saket, I'm going to start with you.
I vote for your grandmother, absolutely. Any day, any day. I think that'll be the most memorable part of this day for me. I think two things. One is that what you all are describing, I've seen again and again. There is, right after the disaster, an extraordinary outpouring of clarity about the right thing to do, right? A lifting of the veil. and we examine our own priorities in our lives. How did it happen that we bought into a culture that says that developing over here rather than respecting nature became the priority, right? And the veil lifts, and for a good 6 weeks to 6 months, there's an outpouring of focused energy and anger. And then what you're going to find is that it's going to be very hard to sustain that. It's going to be very hard to sustain that, and the forces on the other side have a lot more power and money and lobbying infrastructure. And so one is, I would say you need stories to keep the flame burning. And it's very hard to tell activist stories in a way that breaks through, because we love thinking about activists as do-gooders. But activists are just as complicated as the most fascinating characters in literature or cinema. And so I would say, please pick activists who are not perfect people, who are not saints, but who are just as conflicted and just as fascinating as any great fictional character, right? And then the second thing there is that we've had a period where Hollywood has been really in love with the anti-hero. And obviously that's not new. Shakespeare, arguably invented the anti-hero, and who's better than Richard III? But I would refer you all to a great little novella called Small Things Like These, in which Claire Keegan does an extraordinary job of not of building an anti-hero, but a complicated hero. Somebody who comes with great difficulty, comes to choose the hard but the right thing to do. And that can make for a fascinating story for these times.
Thank you so much, Saket. Rafael.
I'm going to surprise all of you by not picking my grandma. And I'm actually going to pick my neighbor, my 62-year-old jovial neighbor, James, who we lovingly refer to as the mayor of my block.
That's right.
Because when any gossip or chisme is going on, James is the first to know. His is the oldest Black-owned home in my entire neighborhood. When the fires broke out, James hid inside his basement to protect himself from the fires, and he fought the fires with his little water hose. And when looting began, he sat in his car with a revolver on his lap, telling everyone with ill intent to please keep it moving. And when the National Guard showed up, he hid in his living room until the entire neighborhood was cleared out, and he was the last remaining and only person in the entire block. James took care of our neighborhood. James secured our neighborhood. And when time came, he started cleaning the neighborhood because none of us could get back in. When I think about the hero of my story, it has to do with the mayor of my block, because a lot of reporting came out at that time, and we unfortunately lost some residents who were trying to fight the fires. They lost their lives. And everyone kept asking, how could they do that? And when you think about James and now my family, their generational homes are their generational wealth. And no one was going to take James away from his home. That's the only financial security that he had in this world. Right. So the question is not how could they do that? The question is how could they not? Woo. And James is the hero of my story.
Yes. Nobody brought tissues up for us.
Wait, and now you do, you've done the organizing with you have like block captains now in Altadena, so you literally do have mayors of all your block. And that's been really ineffective, and I think we should have block captains across the entire, LA region. Like, let's all get together and organize with our neighbors. Mine is a twist on that. Did you all hear of the Rent Brigade that came out of the fire? So this was a group of people who were, tenant activists who started to notice the price gouging that happened in the days after the fire. And I wrote a profile of some of them, literally just people on their laptops getting together either over Zoom or in people's apartments and going after the corporate landlords that were jacking up the prices like in some cases, thousands of dollars over what they were supposed to do. And they were scaring people enough on their own that they did not even need, they got tons of, viral, news stories. It was covered in like every publication, but they had some of these people, these landlords, like calling them and saying, please take me off this list. I swear I'll change it. I swear I'll change it. And like, you just saw this like real power dynamic being upended. They've gotten tons of support, and they've put out some other reports on how bad displacement was, and of course this problem isn't going away. There was another one about Airbnb and how we can't even track Airbnb gouging. Speaking of mega events coming in here, this is all going to come to a head in the next few years. So look up the Rent Brigade and follow the stories of some of these people, because this was like bullying in a good way, and I think like it actually like really helped people to know that you are being watched, and you can't just pull this on people who are kicked out of their homes for goodness knows how long, but really a way the community came together and said we're watching out for each other. So
Beautiful. Your protagonist?
You have to make me go after everyone else. No, the thing that I think about, I mean, I agree with all of it. It's just, I was even having a conversation with my mom earlier that, you always think about these things, and with my kids, it's, especially when you're in Hollywood and you're thinking about, we were upstairs earlier and we see like all these pictures of all the famous actors have now since passed on. But, for them, their lives still live on because they're still people are still able to watch them, right? But for us as regular people, the things that you think about is when you are thinking about your neighbor or your grandmother or other family members, to them, they are your Hollywood movie star, right? And so for that, like I think about my grandmother who went toe-to-toe with Steven Spielberg and actually made sure that the Bayona wetlands wasn't built on, or she protected our actual sage fields, our sacred sage fields. And so thinking about, like, I always joke about it, but it's also true that, like, I'm one of the most Hollywood Indians, like, you can actually have, because our tribal territory is actually in Hollywood. But have I ever really seen myself or my people really portrayed in film? No. It's, when we're thinking about it, we're thinking of, like, the old, Wild Wild West or Hollywood Indian and cowboys. It's mostly Plains Indians, and even, like, a lot of activists that are out. Like, I feel like the real story that's there also in Hollywood and the things that are going on are the traditional stewards that are here, and people like my grandmother that were fighting for things and being environmental badasses when nobody was doing it at the time. She had she thought about these things prior to a lot of people thinking about it and really realizing that we needed to protect these areas, but also, thinking about in real time that it's like, there's a lot of us, even out in the audience, that are living two worlds, right? We have our careers, but we also have the things that we hold near and dear to us. But I just want to leave you with this thought, is that in our language, there's no word for nature because we were never supposed to be separated from it. And so until we actually see ourselves as part of nature and not over nature and living in that reciprocity with the environment, I think that's the real story, is telling that story of nature, telling the story of the deers that came back down from those hillsides that had burns on them afterwards, telling the story about the deer that even came to where our land is, that we've never seen deer before in that area because they're escaping. That story of resilience, and even talking about P22 and talking about resilience and survival in these animal species, but also how our indigenous people see ourselves in that mirrored image of them, that we're a story of survival. And at times, when we do see the Hollywood Indian that's portrayed in film and TV, we're even left out of the conversation with that. And, we need to be making sure that we are talking about stories about the real people that were fighting these climate disasters, the real people that continue to fight this. Because when we see ourselves in those roles too, we can actually think, hey, we can also do something too. And I think that big changes start with little movement.
Thank you so much. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. Thank you, panelists. Really appreciate it.